Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I think a couple people are still loading in, but we'll get started. So I want to welcome you all first to the 2021 Massachusetts Poetry Festival. This is the State of Poetry panel, one of the festival's most popular events in the past, and we're so happy to be able to bring it back this year with this amazing group of panelists and our wonderful host. I'd also like to start with a land acknowledgement. Mass Poetry in Salem, Massachusetts are on the ancestral territory of the Wampanoag, Nipmuc, Massachusetts, Namkeg, and Agawam. Many other Indigenous communities have lived and moved through this land over thousands of years, and many Indigenous people work and live in these regions today. We'd like to take a moment to honor these ancestral grounds that we are collectively gathered upon and support the resilience and strength that all Indigenous people have shown worldwide. We at Mass Poetry are also intentional about ensuring that events are accessible to everyone. We have closed captions available for this event. If you can't see them, you can turn them on by clicking the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen and then show subtitles. If you'd like to turn them off, you can choose hide subtitles. For anyone who's depending on auto captions today, to ensure chat messages are not popping up over the captions, you can click chat at the bottom of the screen and it will open a chat panel to the right. And now I'd like to introduce our lovely panelists. We have today Jen Benka, Martina Spada, and Jonathan Galassi. Jen Benka serves as the president and executive director of the Academy of American Poets, the producer of Poets.org and Poem a Day, and the largest supporter of poets and poetry organizations in the nation. Jen is also the author of 2 poetry collections and writes and tweets about the importance of poetry in our culture. Martina Spada has published more than 20 books as a poet, editor, essayist, and translator. His new book of poems from Norton is called Floaters. He has received the Ruth Lilly Poetry Prize, the Shelley Memorial Award, the Robert Creeley Award, an Academy of American Poets Fellowship, the Penn Revson Fellowship, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. A former tenant lawyer in Greater Boston, Espada is a professor of English at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Jonathan Galassi is the president of Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. He has published 3 books of poetry and translations of the poetry of Eugenio Montale, Giacomo Leopardi, and Primo Levi. His first novel, Muse, was published in 2015. He is co-editor with Robin Cresswell of the FSG Poetry Anthology, which will be published this coming November. And now I'm very happy to introduce our host today, Cristela Guerra, an award-winning journalist and senior arts and culture reporter from WBUR's The Artery, where she covers race and equity. She also volunteers her time with Girls Inc. as a mentor, and in 2019, Amplify Latinx nominated her as one of their 2019 Latina leaders. In 2014, she was part of a team that won a regional and national Edward R. Murrow Award for a 2-day series called A Spark of Hope. As a journalist, she's covered topics such as the COVID-19 pandemic, blizzards, immigration policy, the aftermath of Hurricane Maria in the mainland, and now the state of poetry. Thank you all.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm really excited to be here and speak to our panelists about what feels like a really broad, major, massive topic that I think we're going to try and distill to the best of our ability within an hour, which might be difficult. But I hope those who are watching will put their questions in the chat, because I would love to just have this be sort of a dialogue. I don't want it to feel like we're talking at you. I feel like we all have opinions on the state of poetry as a whole, but also within the last year, how poetry has moved us, how it's probably helped us through some very difficult times, and how it always tends to. I feel like that's always been the case for me. But I thought, I've done a few of these Zoom panels, and I often ask just the question, if you all don't mind, what has the last year been like for you? And that could apply to your writing practice, to your life in general, and to perhaps the poems that you've reached for. But I'd love to understand that first. And anyone can start.
I can start.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, Cristela. And thank you, MP Carver. Thank you, Mass Poetry. And welcome, everyone. I could talk about economics, but I don't really think that's the most important thing I personally could discuss. So this is simply one story of one poet and the pandemic, especially as it began. And to tell you the story, I have to go back, if you'll forgive me, 90 years. My father, Francisco de Espada, Frank Espada, was born in a mountain town called Utuado, Puerto Rico in the year 1930. And he died in Pacifica, California in 2014. Somehow I ended up with his ashes in a box on my bookshelf. Flash forward, fall of 2017, when Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico and devastated my father's hometown of Utuado. I saw Utuado everywhere, on television, on the internet, and I began talking to my father's ashes in the box. And this in turn became a poem called Letter to My Father, wherein I make a promise to scatter his ashes in Utuado. Flash forward to April of 2020. I was scheduled to do a reading at a national writers conference in Puerto Rico at the University of Puerto Rico in Arecibo. Arecibo is not that far from Utuado. And so I started to get questions from there. Are you bringing the ashes? They had seen the poem. Are you going to Utuado? They wanted to know. And people were volunteering their assistance. They wanted to help. Now, you may be aware of just how complicated it is to transport ashes legally by plane. But I managed to gather all the documentation. I needed documentation from Pacifica, California. I need documentation from the island of Puerto Rico. A friend of mine helped me out with that. She also helped me make arrangements for ground transportation to get to my father's hometown. Remember, way up in the mountains, remember, devastated by that hurricane. And then the pandemic hit. And the conference was canceled. And note I say canceled, not postponed, because the entire university system was shut down. There was never, for a moment, any thought given to rescheduling this conference. So all that went away. And my father stayed home with me. And I still had not been able to keep my promise to my father.
When we talked about this, it felt like this is the core of the sort of the, if I can, the losses of the last year. You know, there, like you said, Martin, there's financial, and we discussed that too. But this is something else. Are you still talking to him?
Yeah, well, I mean, why not? He's still here, and I still want to keep that promise, and one day I will. But you know, not yet.
Jonathan, Jen, do you all want to share? Whatever you're comfortable sharing.
Jen.
Sure, and Martine, thank you for sharing that. What a powerful personal lens through which to understand the effects of the pandemic. And it's just such an honor to be in this Zoom room with you and Jonathan and Christella, and thanks to Daniel and Jan and all the good folks at Mass Poetry. I have a couple different lenses to kind of reflect through on the last year. One is just kind of working behind the scenes on poets.org, which is a very popular, often visited site for poetry. And starting in mid-March, as we began understanding that we were facing a global health crisis, our team started working remotely from our homes across the New York City area and beyond. And suddenly we saw more and more and more traffic coming to the website, to the point where we understood that people were seeking out poems. And Christella, as you mentioned at the top of this, poetry seems to be an art form that we go to, not just to mark occasions in our lives, but also in times of crisis. It can function for some like a secular resource, not unlike prayer, not unlike the benefits that we get from meditation. And so we just saw more and more people reading poems, and we launched a series called Shelter in Poems, and wound up doing an online reading, which we'd never done before. We'd never done anything like we're all used to doing now. And we had tens of thousands of people log on from around the world and join us in a kind of communion rooted in poetry. So it's been kind of remarkable to see that. I also right away started hearing from poets in need. One of the things that we do at the Academy of American Poets is try to be helpful, particularly in times of crisis. And I'm certainly painfully aware that many, many poets work in the gig economy. Many are adjuncts and many don't have health insurance. More often than not, the poets who come to us in need are coming to us because they don't have health care, and because they need to allocate financial resources to pay for things like medication or doctor visits or surgeries. Housing suddenly becomes at risk. Food sometimes becomes at risk. So while on one hand, I think I personally was very buoyed, my spirit was lifted by seeing how people were coming to poetry, I was also panicked by seeing the number of poets who were in crisis. And one of the things that our organization did was become a part of an effort called Artist Relief, where we raised philanthropic dollars to then grant out to what is now more than 4,000 individual artists across the United States and in US territories who have faced precarity because of COVID-19. And doing that kind of emergency grant relief work with an understanding that certain communities have been disproportionately affected by the crisis. So yeah, maybe I'll stop there for now. But the past year in general, I'm just grateful that poetry has been there for so many thousands of people, offering comfort, courage, solace, uplift. But I'm also continuing to worry about the makers of those poems that we need so very much.
I'll just add that we're publishers of poets, and one thing that struck me very forcefully last year was how the the demand for the books, not just poetry, but other books, was very, very strong. And I think that's kind of a repetition in a different way of what Jen was saying, that people turn to literature for understanding, for solace, for echo, for response. And that was pretty amazing to me, actually, as someone who often feels that the things we're doing go into a void, and there's not as much response as we think there should be. But in this particular moment of terrible crisis, the response, the demand, the need for what we do was and is very, very real. And that's heartening in many ways. And one thing that we missed a lot, and I know Jen feels this too from the Academy, is live events, live readings, live exchange, which is really kind of the heart of the poetry. And I'm sure Martine feels this too. It's the heart of the practice of poetry in society, maybe not in the writing of poetry, but in the sharing of it. But we had events like the one we're having now, where people connect virtually in a very powerful way. We just had, Jen just had her annual Poetry in the Creative Mind event, and it was there were 12,000 people or something.
No, Jonathan, 30,000.
What? 30,000? No, that's a kind of megaphoning of connection that is very, very amazing. So I would say that aspect of this crisis made me feel, and I'm sure you two feel the same way, that what we're involved in is really useful to people.
Let me note in the chats, folks are saying Shelter in Poems was great, thank you. And I will never forget the evening my husband and I listened to Shelter in Poems. That was when I knew we would make it through to the other side. And
gosh, that's amazing. Thanks for sharing that.
And for Martin, thank you, Martin. Poems are promises and modes of presence, now in isolation more than ever. Something that was very real that we saw in Boston was every place that I listened to poetry on a consistent basis when we were allowed to see poems in person closed. Bella Luna and JP was it's called oh my gosh, they're gonna kill me. The poetry night is If You Can Feel It, You Can Speak It, which is a BIPOC, queer, fantastic community that's been around for 10 years. And that was their place, although they'd been in others. And many people probably here know the Cantab in Cambridge that also had the basement where poems would be read by many college freshmen about a first love. And Haley House, which has the House Slam, and thank goodness at least Portia O, who's one of the coaches, is now doing a Roxbury Poetry Festival, which is a first for Roxbury in early June. And I'm very, very excited about that. I think Portia's been doing a lot with her home series in Boston. This is, there's actually a question that I want to get to at the top. I find it really interesting from Donna. She said, I am an RN working as a case manager in Boston, in a Boston teaching hospital. I'm very new to trying to write poetry. I'm going to try and write a poem about my ER experience. Any suggestions to get started? I'm sure we have 114 participants. I'm sure there's other aspiring poets who feel kind of similar about maybe moments in their life they want to write about. Do you all have some tips? And I think this applies specifically to poetry in turmoil, right? Poetry that comes up at moments where I could write about this, but do you want to? lead out like that?
That's a very good question. I mean, her question and your question. First, the good news. The good news is that poets have always risen to the occasion in times of turmoil. Poets have always risen to the occasion in times of great strife, whether it's war or pandemic, whatever it might be. We can go back 100 years and think of Wilfred Owen and the First World War. In terms of the pardon the pun, because we're talking about a nurse, the case at hand, the question is not simply how do you rise to the occasion, but how best do you rise to the occasion? Yes, you should write about this. How do you write about it well? My own experience is the experience of having been a tenant lawyer. I worked as a tenant lawyer in Greater Boston, in Chelsea to be precise, in the late 80s and early 1990s. I was a supervisor of a program called Su Clínica Legal. It was a legal services program for low-income Spanish-speaking tenants in Chelsea, right across the Tobin Bridge from Boston, a gateway city, a city of immigrants. It always has been. And the immigrants came from the Spanish-speaking Caribbean and they came from Central America. They're still coming. So the challenge when I published a collection of poems focused on that experience was called City of Coughing and Dead Radiators. Note, not cold radiators, as in there's no heat, but dead radiators, as in no heat forthcoming. How do you do that? How do you honor the experience and still write good poems? And I felt it was very important to ground the poems in the image, to ground the poems in the senses, to ground the poems in metaphor and simile, to ground the poems in lived experience with the addition of the poetic imagination, to ground the poems in musicality, right, the sound of the language, to protect the confidentiality of the client where it was necessary, and even when it was unnecessary to do so. And parenthetically, I know that's a major stumbling block for certainly for legal aid lawyers, and I know it has also proved to be the case for doctors and nurses as well. How do I tell the story and still preserve the confidentiality and the dignity of the subject? Well, you know, those were the challenges that I was confronted with, and yet the compulsion to speak overcame any inhibitions I may have had. And so I worked it through. Now, there are also very good examples out there in the world of doctor poets. And I think first and foremost of Dr. Rafael Campo, who is based in Boston and has written magnificently about his patients and has done so in what he calls broken sonnets to reflect the broken world of the patient, where he tries, as he puts it, to give the appropriated narrative back to the suffering human being. And I think that's what we should be trying to do if we are doctors, nurses, legal aid lawyers, anyone else who is acting professionally and poetically as advocate, speaking on behalf of those without an opportunity to be heard.
Others?
More practically, I would just say to this person, the person who wants to write about the ER experience, it's picking up from what Martine said, really, just pick 10 images that you can't forget and somehow work with those, repeat them, look at them from different angles, and make a kind of refrain, use them in ways that aren't just prosaic, but try to make those into the basis of your poem. That's just a suggestion.
Can I add? The Rafael Campo deconstructed sonnets about the emergency room. It's called 10 Patients and Another. 10 Patients and Another. And it's from his collection, The Other Man Was Me.
There you go.
Jen, do you want to, before I move on?
I mean, that that was a masterclass. Thank you, Martine and Jonathan. I think I couldn't agree more with the importance of both reading other poets who may be addressing similar subject matter, like Raphael. Another doctor poet I think of too is Fade Judah. Maybe check out his work. And then I love what Martine, you said about kind of trusting the compulsion. I think art starts with that urge. And if you're feeling that urge, to let yourself trust it, and not only to read, but maybe create for yourself some structures. Jonathan, as you were talking, I was thinking very much of Joe Brainerd and the sort of I remember exercise of just repeating, I remember, and then an image. I remember, and then an image. I remember, and then an image. And Brainerd, who we sadly lost to AIDS, collected a book that is just all based on that refrain. And what's phenomenal is how expansive it is. So I would offer that as well.
I'm running out of material when I do panels, but this came up when I was doing a panel on writing recently, and I brought up, it was, I think, Ruth Stone, who said that she would view a poem coming at her like a train, that it was a train barreling over the landscape far on the horizon, and she knew that if she didn't do her very, very best to catch it, by the end, it would pass through her home, and go on and find another poet. She had to rush and write it as soon as possible. And if she wrote it too late, sometimes she would write it backwards, because she would write it from the end to the start. But the visuals I think she would use was like, she could hear it coming and she needed to write it. Was it Rilke that said, if you must write, she just had to, the compulsion is there. And that's how I feel about poetry too. Although I will say that sometimes it felt like, especially in slam, they were almost seeking, the most snaps you would get was for the most trauma. So I would also caution to be ready when you're addressing your innermost demons, right? Like if you're already having tea with them and you can write a poem, fantastic. But sometimes I feel like I write poetry about things, and it's a catharsis, and it's also extremely exhausting. Maybe also when you're delivering it in front of a crowd, and at times it's helped a lot. I don't know if it's any good, but this is coming from someone who writes poetry for herself and has a lot during the pandemic. I'd ask, and then there's some questions I want to get to in the chat, but do you all remember the first time a poem or poetry touched your lives? Do you remember what that first poem was, or that instance, or that moment was was it when you were older or younger? When was it?
I can think of a few. I don't know if I remember the first one, but I can remember that the year was, I believe, 1979, 1980. And I remember reading some poems by Ernesto Cardenal. Now, this was published in an edition by New Directions, and they did not publish bilingual editions in those days, so I was reading translation. And there were these very short poems. I would learn later they were called epigrams or epigramas, and many of them were very political. And so I encountered these poems, and then I believe it was in 1980 when the four women from the Catholic Church were murdered in El Salvador. There was a rally and a vigil at the University of Wisconsin-Madison campus, and we were asked to put together, as part of that rally and vigil, a reading of poetry. I chose a series of poems from Ernesto Cardenal, and it still resonates with me. Those poems still resonate with me. I still teach them, as a matter of fact. And they resonate with me in another way too. I just noticed in the chat that my next reading has been announced, May 20th, 7:30, Witness at the Border. And I have been doing a lot of work around the border. I'm an activist having to do with border issues. And I think oftentimes people in this country forget that people crossing the southern border from Guatemala, from El Salvador, have a culture too. They are not merely victims. They are certainly not predators. They carry their own cultural and poetic tradition with them. You know, the people coming from Guatemala are not merely a political problem for Joe Biden. They bring with them Otto Rene Castillo, a great poet from Guatemala who was murdered by his own government, burned alive, as a matter of fact. People from El Salvador are not merely political pawns for the Republican Party. They have their own poetic tradition. Roque Dalton, Claribel Alegría, who I was privileged to know. And when we realize that people crossing the border come from a culture that has produced great poetry, they become more human to us. And we, therefore, just possibly might treat them as human too.
I will ask, this is an interesting question, Martin. It kind of goes with what you're saying. I feel that after this past year, poetry is going through an identity crisis. COVID lifted the veil of our society in many ways. Has it also broken open poetry? Jonathan, I think you wanted to get into some poetic styles, poetic forms, poetic styles, poetic meaning. Is poetry broken? Or, as I would potentially ask, is it being reborn constantly? Is it active and alive and always changing in the way, in the form that inspires it? Because there have been so many things. I mean, there have been so many things, but if I could honestly offer, I think over the last year, I've seen some joyful poetry. There's been some joy that people have found in the midst of like isolation and moments of loss. I lost my grandmother last year, and the poetry that was born of remembering her in the mornings, eating bread and coffee. Like, it's just, yeah, I don't know. And I also think as a journalist, often you see obituaries that make people saints. I don't want to hear an obituary that makes somebody a saint. I want an elegy that honors them in this full way. I want to know their flaws and their mistakes. So is poetry broken?
Are you asking me that question?
Yes, Jonathan, please tell me. Broken.
Poetry is not broken. And I think that, I think when people are reaching for poems and looking for solace or looking for response to their own emotions, they often are looking to just as Martine was talking about some of the doctor poet, Roque Dalton, these are poets. They weren't writing about the pandemic. They were writing about life as they experienced it. And I think that great poetry is applicable to all situations, really. You feel it in different ways. It works on you in different ways, but it's not necessarily poems that were written in the last year that are the ones that are going to speak to you the most. They may be the most useful to you as in writing, in making sense of a crisis, but they may not be as useful to other people as they are to you. I think that time tells with poetry. I think immediacy is a powerful thing, but reflection is something else that has a deep resonance too. What do the others think?
Jen?
I would just say, in no way do I think that poetry is broken. I think poetry has broke open. I think, I was on this panel, The State of Poetry, for the as part of this festival at this point, I think 7 years ago. And at that moment in time, we were combating what even then was a misperception that poetry doesn't matter, poetry is dead, no one reads poetry. Again, that was a misperception then. Fast forward 7 years, there's absolutely no way at all that we can understand poetry in the United States today as anything but coming into its most ecstatic own. I mean, poetry is incredibly alive, and the incredible diversity of poets who are performing and writing and publishing today, we've not seen it. And Christella, I would use a word that you invoked, which is joy. I mean, I think that it is a joyful moment for poetry, even though a lot of poets that we're publishing on poets.org through our Poem a Day series, a lot of poets are, really wrestling with current events and personal experiences, and sometimes the subject matter is really hard. Mm-hmm. But when I zoom out 30,000 feet and I look at poetry today, I just am overwhelmed by how alive it is.
I think people crave meaning. Mm-hmm. They crave meaning, especially in moments of crisis. What could be more meaningless on the face of it than mass death and mass suffering? Why? People crave meaning in such moments, and they turn to poets and poetry in such moments. In the way that a more religious society used to turn to religion. I ended up at one point doing quite a number of memorial services. This was back a few years. I once did 6 memorial services in 12 months because people saw poets as providing some meaning they craved. And I believe that we are now in a similar historical moment, which is not to say that the poem that you write yesterday is going to be the poem you turn to tomorrow for solace or for wisdom or for joy. It's not to say that the poem you just wrote will still be there in any real way 10 years from now. I still haven't written a poem about this pandemic, I did manage to write a poem about a cholera epidemic in Puerto Rico in 1856, and a doctor named Ramon Emeterio Betances, who fought against that epidemic of cholera, who saw that it was killing off enslaved people at an alarming rate, 1/3 of all those who died, probably more, who began to organize an abolitionist movement right in the middle of the cholera epidemic, was ultimately exiled, and from exile would lead a revolution to oust an empire, Spain. That to me demonstrates the possibilities of society in flames. And so I wanted to write that poem, and I did. But I also wrote that poem because I had the vocabulary to write that poem. I had the experience to write that poem. I don't know if I'm ready to write my first poem about what's happening right now. Might take me a while even yet.
I want to welcome Tahimba Jess. Can you hear me? Hi. Thank you
Hi.
for joining us. I want to ask the festival to give me another hour of conversation because I'm enjoying this so much. Tahimba, I just started this with just asking folks what the last year was like, to bring it out sort of from a 30,000 foot perspective, to ask how it informed your writing, the lack thereof. What has the last year been like for you, if you wouldn't mind?
I would say that for me personally, it's been it's been pretty rough in terms of creativity. I'm going to be 100% on that. But I also have been inspired, I think, well, really in ways that that poets have kind of adopted to this kind of electronic sphere, and have gained new ways, or resolved new ways to meet that, just really frankly would not have happened before, and really frankly will not be the same after now. I mean, I can't imagine many readings that will be happening in the future that will not have a kind of Zoom or kind of electronic component to them that will expand the audience. That's one thing I definitely have observed. And I think the other thing is the level of protest that happened during particularly 2020, and may still, I imagine, will be happening in 2021, has been chronicled by so many of the poems and so many of the poetic endeavors. Yeah.
I was just going to note that Amber said that she agrees with you, and that hearing young voices of the poet laureates who were part of the festival yesterday were proof of that joy that I think you were talking about. Jeffrey said, as Wallace Stevens said, the imagination presses back against the pressure of reality that can take many forms. And folks, I mean, please continue asking us questions. I really want to continue engaging. I think we have 15 minutes, and I think we can cover everything in 15 minutes, more than we can even imagine. Tim, but if you wouldn't mind me asking you another question, I know that you just got here. I asked folks what was the first poem that they remember touching them? Like, when did poetry kind of knock on your door and tell you that it was a medium that you should use? Do you remember that?
Huh. I would probably say, if I were to go back to grade school, it'd probably be Paul Laurence Dunbar. Little Brown Baby with Sparkling Eyes. That'd probably be one of the poems that struck me. But I would also say the poems of Amiri Baraka, Reached Out, Slapped Me Across the Face, Befuddled Me, made me wake up, and made me be aware in ways that I hadn't been aware before. I do want to say that if it hasn't been said today, that one of the things that that has risen over the last 25, 20 years, 30 years, has been the rise of poetry collectives and fellowships of people of color like Cave Canem, The Watering Hole, Canto Mundo, Kundaman, the Hurston Wright project, the Callaloo had a kind of poetry retreat for a while. All of these projects gathered the voices of people of color, and particularly Black poets, Latinx poets, and Asian American poets, and allowed them to hear each other without the voice of a kind of white arbiter or a white professor being engaged in the development of those voices. And all of those projects, Furious Flower, all of those projects have been going for the last 25, 30 years and have really been, can't stress this enough, have really been the major force behind the change of the face of American poetry. If you look at the last 5 Pulitzer Prize winners, that have been Black, including myself, they've all come from Cave Canem. They've all been Cave Canem fellows. And I could go down the list and talk about National Book Award winners. I could talk about all kinds of other accolades. And also, I could also talk about professorships that people have had in various colleges and universities, and various opportunities that people have taken to build other fellowships outside of those fellowships I've named, that have really been a major contribution to the way that American poetry has dramatically changed.
This reminds me of one of my very favorite stories, which I've heard Elizabeth Acevedo say at least twice in person, where she talks about being in school, and I think she was studying, it was a creative writing class, or beyond that, I think she was, in her MFA, and her professor was teaching them how to write odes, and she was told to pick an animal to write an ode to, and everyone was picking, gosh, I can't tell it as well as she can, but I think she said they all picked doves or deer, or some other random animal found in a forest that maybe I would have never seen in Panama growing up. And I think then the professor asked her, and she said, well, I'd like to write an ode to the rat. And he said, well, that's not a very noble animal. And man, that ode to the rat is one of my very favorite pieces of writing, if just because it's a giant fuck you to that professor in every way possible. By the end of that poem, you're looking at rats thinking, well, my God, The other thing I was going to note was there's two poets, Justice Amir and Chrysanthemum Tran. They are 2 trans women in the New England area. They were part of the House Slam, and they did a performance that I wrote about, where what was revolutionary about their poetry is because it's joyful. And as trans women, seeing the amount of death that's happening, the epidemic of trans people being oppressed, they themselves decided to take it upon themselves to write poetry that praised living on a daily basis and walking outside, even when you didn't feel like doing so. So I would say, if we're talking, Tahimba, somebody asked if poetry was broken, and I think, Jen, your answer was right on point. I mean, it's broken open, and what we're seeing is an outpouring of just, break the form, do what moves you, write about what hasn't been written about before. There's nothing wrong with deer. I just don't need I don't want an ode to deer. I have no interest in deer, to be honest. Jonathan, you mentioned something that I'd hope that maybe you can touch on, is how do poets talk about the past and the future, and what makes work memorable? Do you want to kind of talk to what you feel when it comes to writing about time and how it passes, or?
Well, I think it's so different for everyone, but I do think that some way of seeing things as recurrent, as being part of cycles is always very moving, and but it's different for every person, really. But I do think that memorability is always something that I find very moving in poetry, but there are many different ways of doing it. There's no one recipe, as all these people here are proving.
Someone in the audience said, I don't think it's overly dramatic to say that poetry has saved lives. I absolutely agree with that. And Jen, someone asked earlier that I'd love to hear your thoughts on what do you see on the horizon for poetry this year as we come out of the pandemic?
That's a big question. I mean, I think that we have entered American poetry's heyday. I think I couldn't agree more with Tohimba's crediting and pointing to the incredible work of poetry organizations that have been creating spaces for poets of color to mentor one another, champion one another. And I agree. I mean, those organizations and the poets who've been affiliated with them and have come out of those organizations have really contributed to carrying American poetry forward to where it is today. I think that as we move out of this once in a century, let's hope, public health crisis, that honestly the work of poets will be really important in our understanding and making sense. As Martine said, people crave meaning. We've just collectively gone through something that we will need to process. And I think, poetry, because it's art made of language, the material that we use in a day-to-day basis, but elevated and, as Jonathan said, made memorable, that we will need poets. We will need poems. Poetry is the language of loss. It's the language of love. It's where we find insight into, fundamental human questions. And this has been a time of profound questions. So when I look ahead just, 12 months, I just think that at the Academy we'll probably be, again, on poets.org and Poem a Day, publishing a lot of work about these experiences. I think, like Martine described in terms of Martine, your own writing process, that there will be poets who will need more critical distance and time in order to start translating this experience in time on the page. But I think that we'll start seeing some work trying to start making meaning of this moment. And I'm looking forward to those poems because I need to read them as much as anybody else.
I think it's useful to define also what we mean by the word we here. We talk about we. Who is the we? Because poetry belongs to everyone. Poetry, like bread, is for everyone. And so it should go beyond the expected places. It should go beyond those places to those so-called non-traditional settings, which are in fact the most traditional of all, because they're rooted in community, they're rooted in oral traditions. A couple of days ago, the last reading I did was for an ELL program, English Language Learners Program, in Chelsea, at Chelsea High School. Yes, the same place where I used to practice as a tenant lawyer. And I did that for an audience of mostly young Salvadoran Guatemalan students. In the process, they taught me something, which is usually the way it works. I have a poem called Ode to the Soccer Ball Flying Over a Barbed Wire Fence. It's a poem about the internment camp for adolescent migrants at Tornillo, Texas, that was shut down by protests during the Trump administration. Well, it turns out that some of the people in my audience were incarcerated at Tornillo. And so the poetry had come full circle. And the first poem I read to them was the Ode to the Soccer Ball. I learned from them just as they're learning from me. And that's why we have to go to those places.
I want to note that Tracy said no one's mentioned the word therapeutic. For many of us, poetry is therapeutic, allowing us directly or indirectly to express strong feelings and then have them and our personal sense of meaning in a poem witnessed by others. And I missed a few folks, but I think someone said during an interview in the 2000s, Raul Zurita said that a poet gets 3 good ideas during their lifetime. I'm currently waiting for my 3rd. And I think that connects then to what May asked, what good ideas are you currently pursuing? Anyone on the panel, can you tell us a bit about this little insight into your years-long process and approach to your poems and projects, you know, in the final 3 minutes we have, although I'm kind of hoping they give us a little extra time.
Well, I'll say that one thing I'm really interested in is history and the way that our understanding of history unravels the further we go forward in time, the more we discover about the past. So I'm still interested in many of the issues, historical issues, and in documentary poetics that are still unraveling today.
I have some ideas. It's too early to say whether they're any good.
Jonathan?
Well, I think Tyemba's right that the present changes the past. You know, the past is always changing because of what we bring to it, and we read it in different ways. It becomes the substrate of our thoughts, and it's transforming all the time and refocusing us, and it's a dialogue really that keeps on changing and happening, and it's part of, I think it's part of what's most exciting about poetry, is that poetry is really, it's not, poetry is a continuum that goes all the way back, and it keeps what we read in the past is different now because of what we experience, what we know and see.
Jen?
I love all these ideas about time and the reminder that time is not a line. In some cases, I think of it as a double helix, some sort of spiraling galaxy, and it's just, I think, useful for us to think that way. In terms of my own projects, you know, I kind of operate on 2 tracks when I think about my creative work. Part of my creative praxis is administrative and toward organizing in the literary community. And so one of the things that I'm starting to work on and think about is just how to continue supporting smaller poetry organizations and presses. One of the projects I worked on in the past 12 months was organizing a literary arts emergency fund. So in addition to helping raise funds to support individual poets and artists and writers, I was also helped launch and create an effort that helped support orgs and publishers, and I'm hoping to keep that going with some organizational partners. So I, again, kind of my creative life, because I'm a sort of, I don't know, an admin nerd thinking about those sorts of organizing projects. And then in terms of personal writing, just really want to continue connecting and lifting up queer voices.
Funny you say that, because I was going to end, well, potentially end if MP lets me get to some of the other questions. I would love it. But I was going to say, I mean, we all know the quote by Audre Lorde, which I look to a lot, that poetry is not a luxury, it is a vital necessity of our existence. It forms the quality of the light within which we predicate our hopes and dreams towards survival and change, first made into language, then into idea, and then into more tangible action. So my final question to each of you would be, you know, poets are beloved when their language is beautiful, but they're revolutionary when their language is challenging us and pushing us to our greater selves. You know, what's the responsibility poets have to our society? And I think it goes with the question asked about poetry and politics. Do you think the role of a poet is in social political change? How do poets speak to politics without slipping into propaganda?
You have another hour? Or maybe another conference. You know, we touched upon this distinction at the beginning in responding to the ER nurse who wants to write poetry about her experience. I believe that one of the ways in which you distinguish between a good political poem and a bad political poem, between art and propaganda, is by being as concrete and specific as possible, by being grounded in the image, metaphor and simile, by being rooted in the senses, by being centered on the narrative, especially if it's, as they say these days, a decentered narrative, right? That at the end of the day, yes, there are plenty of bad political poems out there, but there are also plenty of bad love poems. And there are also plenty of bad poems about trees. I don't think writing a political poem inclines it to being a bad poem any more than any other sort of a poem. Right? So I think it's an important distinction to make. Now, in terms of where we go next, I think we have to insist upon telling the truth, but telling it slant. We have to insist upon telling the truth as we see it, regardless of party affiliation. So when I see the same injustices committed by the Biden administration on the southern border, when I see them invoking Title 42, which is exactly the same trick pulled by the Trump administration, allegedly to keep migrants out because they represented a threat to public health, it's my job to say no. It's my job to say this is just as much an injustice as that injustice. And not to take the pulse of the audience before I open my mouth and I say that. Now, sometimes poets are told by the idea that they can't quantify their political impact on the world. We have to let go of that idea. Because our impact as poets, and especially as poets who write about social themes, cannot be weighed, measured, labeled, boxed. Instead, I fall back upon something a professor of mine used to say at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His name was Herbert Hill. He was former National Labor Director of the NAACP and a major force in the civil rights movement. And he used to say, ideas have consequences. Ideas have consequences, simply but elegantly expressed. And what better way to express an idea than poetically?
Well, damn, I don't know how to add to that. I've been been reading Martin Espada for so many years, and he's been so inspiring. That's that pretty much sums it up for me. The only thing I would add to that is that we are at a time when there's the opportunity to re-understand, recreate, re-examine the history, the bloodline, the construction, the literal iconography and geography of our poetry and all of our literary fields, and to go back and reconstruct. We won't be able to really understand how messed up we are until we go back and face it with the kind of truth and the kind of image, use of the image and honesty that Brother Martin was talking about.
Well, don't you think it's true that everything written is political in one way or another? It's how we deconstruct it, how we understand it, that's what the present does to the past, I think.
I would agree. Everything has a political, can be seen in a political light. That's a whole nother conference. What is a political poem? But I think that I want to say, in particular, in regards to, because I want to say that it's been my observation that many, particularly African American poets I can speak to, have a real direct interest in the understanding the history that has been so obfuscated and so discarded and so erased in so many different ways, that when we look at the historical record that's emerging right now, like for instance, just a tiny little thing. We just found out that something that happened in the 1980s, the bombing of the MOVE house, right? They took the bones of those little children that were killed in that MOVE house, and they used them as some kind of learning tool in a university, right? That informs us about the relationship of the state to the academy, relationship of the police to the bodies of Black people, right? We're just finding that, relatively recent history out, but that gives us a whole different understanding of what of the chillingness of the icy vein madness of the police state. And it also puts me in the mind of another poet, Marilyn Nelson, who wrote about the bones of a enslaved African who was owned by a doctor, died, and then he took the man's bones and put them up in his office as a kind of learning tool. Fortune's Bones, Marilyn Nelson. But it also gives us that connection between now and the past, and that's what I'm talking about. Is bringing that kind of historical awareness and really plumbing it and at the same time being able to disseminate that historical information in ways that historians would not be able to really imagine, and reach audiences that historians, I'm talking hardcore historians, really wouldn't be able to do. So yeah.
I would just note to him, but gosh, it's amazing being in a Zoom room with you as well. What an honor. I would just love to add, no one asks, what's a dancer's role in society, right? Huh. But yet, I can't tell you the number of panels I've been on where the question, what is a poet's role in society, is asked. And quite clearly, the simple fact that it's asked is the answer, right? That that clearly poets do have some role in society. And, you know, I think what that role is many. And I love what Martine said, and thinking about this panel, I was thinking about Poetry Like Bread, and the first time I encountered that book, and how what you said, Martine, ideas have consequences. You know, I feel like sometimes encountering poems and books makes space for a person. You know, Poetry Like Bread made space for me to think about poetry in a new way. And my thinking about poetry in a new way led me on my path to be not just a you know, aspiring writer myself, but a worker, a cultural worker, a poetry worker, someone who works in service to other poets. Someone in the chat invoked Rukeyser, who's one of my guardian angels. And she has an incredible collection of essays called The Life of Poetry, which I recommend. And she says something along the lines of, you know, art is not action, but it prepares us for action. And I hope that one of the things that poetry does is help us prepare to make change.
I think this is a perfect place to wrap it up. And I'm so thankful and I'm honored to have been a part of this conversation, and thank you for taking the time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christella.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you all so
Thanks.
much. Yes, and I just want to encourage everybody in the audience too to make sure to join us later for the headline reading with Portia Olayiwola, Tayemba Jess, and Naomi Shihab Nye. What a wonderful, insightful panel. Thank you again to Martina Spada, Jonathan Galassi, Tayemba Jess, Jen Benka, and of course, Christella Guerra. Enjoy the rest of the festival.
Thank you.